Hello, everyone. Welcome to Goucher Environmental Dialogues. Whether this is your first time joining a Goucher Environmental Dialogues or you've been to several of these, I'm Dr. Jen DeRosa. I'm the director of Goucher College's Environmental Sustainability and Management program. And Goucher Environmental Dialogues is really our web-based speaker series where we feature, in my view, a cultivated conversation with an environmental expert or a sustainability leader or a climate visionary. And it's hosted by our master's degree in environmental sustainability and management. And if you happen to have any questions about our actual master's degree program, in June, I'm hosting a webinar on green careers and grad school. And I'll share the link to that in the chat in just a little bit in case you're interested. Otherwise, too, you can kind of keep an eye on our social media, and we'll periodically update you when we have additional workshops and webinars that you might be interested in. Our conversation today is about bird-friendly landscaping, reducing the threats to birds, and the conservation actions that you can take in your own outdoor space. And our guest is Erin Reed Miller. She's the Senior Coordinator of Urban Conservation for Audubon's Mid-Atlantic Baltimore program, which is part of the National Audubon Society. Erin grew up in Pennsylvania before earning her bachelor's degree in wildlife conservation and her Master of Science in wildlife ecology from the University of Delaware. She researched the connection between native plant species and insect communities in the lab of Dr. Doug Tallamy, who's the author of Bringing Nature Home. And she's since served as an interpretive naturalist and environmental educator in Delaware, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. And she's been at Audubon since 2011 as an educator and education manager, and now an urban conservation coordinator where she works with communities to thoughtfully increase bird-friendly habitat while meeting the community's many different goals. And in 2016, Erin was named the Tamar Choatson Audubon Educator of the Year. So just a reminder too, this is a webinar, so you can't actually turn on your camera or your microphone, but you can use the chat. So please use the chat feature to welcome Erin as our guest today. And feel free to use the chat to ask any questions that you have throughout the session. I will try to give voice to your questions when we get towards the last 15 or so minutes of our talk. So join me in giving a warm welcome to Erin. And also in the chat, feel free to indicate where you're logging in from. Sometimes we have folks from in and around Baltimore and sometimes beyond that. So we love to hear that. And again, you can use the chat to ask questions. So welcome, Erin. I'm so excited to be talking to you today, especially in the spring with the birds chirping right outside my window. I would love to get some background first on maybe if you could share a bit about your journey into conservation and what inspired you to focus on bird-friendly gardening.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and happy spring, everybody. It's a great time of year to be thinking about how we can increase how friendly we're being to the environment. Everybody's thinking about those kinds of things in April. I think I came into conservation and being in the outdoors the same way that a lot of people did, which is first having access to a safe place to go outdoors, and then a mentor who took me outside, or maybe sometimes forced me to go outside and play or pull weeds in the garden or whatever the case was. So in my case, that was my dad. He took my brother and I hiking and fishing and passively learning about different kinds of trees, or at least the ones that could give me a rash, being able to identify those. My spark bird, which is what birders call the bird that first got them really intrigued by birds, was an experience that I had as a kid out in the woods and hearing a ruffed grouse drumming. And as a kid, feeling like that drumming was coming from inside my own chest. So that was this real, like, whoa, like nature and the outdoors is really cool. And then, you mentioned in my bio that I had the great fortune of working with Doug Tallamy, who some folks have heard of by now. This was before he had written the book Bringing Nature Home, but as an undergraduate, I wanted to get some research experience, and I was lucky enough to land in his lab. So my research was actually out in suburbia. I was looking at the difference between insect communities in people's yards that were landscaped with natives versus those that were landscaped more traditionally with a mix of native and non-native plants. And that experience, I think, really just drove home to me how much impact people can have on other organisms just with the plants that we choose to surround ourselves with. So, fast forward, my job at Audubon basically let me move up the food chain. So from native plants to insects to birds who eat a lot of insects. But of course, all of those things are connected.
Oh, excellent. What an excellent background to hear about. And while you were describing that, I'm trying to think of what my spark bird species was, and I'm not sure. I think there was almost several of them, but it'd be kind of fun if people are listening, if they have like a bird in mind that really sparked their interest, feel free to share that in the chat as well. So for those who are new to bird-friendly gardening, what are some simple high impact changes that they can make to their yard or their community or whatever access to outdoor space that they have?
Yeah, I think for people who are really new to this idea, the best thing to do is start talking about it more. So, at least for me, I live in a community where our neighbors are talking about things going on all the time and just kind of talking about why native plants or why not put down that blanket of mulch every year. If I have the space to actually plant a native plant, then the simplest, highest impact thing that somebody can do, honestly, is plant an oak tree. Um, of course, everybody wishes that they have space for lots of oak trees, but that's a keystone species that has a really, really complex food web surrounding it. And sorry, when I say species, lots of different species of native oaks, but that's a plant group that is a keystone species in that it impacts many, many other organisms. If you don't have room for an oak tree, plant a blueberry bush or a serviceberry. If you don't have room for a blueberry bush, plant some goldenrods or some asters. I have actually curated a list of what we call top 10s, and these are the top 10 plant genera in the categories of trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants for supporting as many species of butterfly and moth caterpillars as we can. So oaks are at the top of the tree list. Blueberries are at the top of the shrubs list, and goldenrods are at the top of the herbaceous list.
Oh, that's excellent. And actually, I'll probably ask if you can send me that list or a link to the list, and I can
Yeah.
share it with our audience when I send out the recording, which will probably be by tomorrow. So yeah, that way, if anyone forgets or isn't taking notes, they'll have that information at their fingertips.
Yeah.
We were talking before the webinar began, and I confessed to you that I'm a gardener. I'm an avid gardener. Native plants are often discussed among gardeners for different reasons, but can you explain why are native plants so essential for supporting bird populations, and essentially how are they contributing to a healthier ecosystem?
Yeah, I'm glad native plants have become part of the discourse among gardeners now. That wasn't always the case, even though we've known about some of these differences for a little while now. The kind of simplified version of this, and I give hour and a half long workshops on this, but the simple version is that native plants are really essential because they co-evolved with native insects. And insects can't just eat any plant. Plants defend themselves with all of these, nasty chemicals. They don't want to get eaten by insects, of course. So insects have evolved the ability to digest those chemicals in the plants with which they share an evolutionary history. So when insects meet a foreign plant with which they have no evolutionary history, those insects might not even recognize those plants as food. And that might sound good. The horticulture industry really likes to play this up, like buy this plant, it's pest free, it's insect free, right? And we might think that being bug free sounds good, but not if we want to see birds. So most birds, actually 96% of our birds, require insects as part of their diet. And so insects are this really critical link between plants and birds and most other food chains, honestly. So when I mention things like oaks and blueberries and serviceberries and goldenrods, we're choosing native species within those groups of plants because they are the host plants for the most species of insects. And we are essentially trying to plant the most complex ecosystem in our landscape as we can.
That makes sense. I mean, I think the 10-year-old me would have been like, no bugs, ew. But no, I completely hear you. So essentially, a bug-friendly garden is a bird-friendly garden, as a simple rule of thumb. And I know that there's a lot of talk in the spaces that I'm in about like, let's making sure we're supporting the pollinators. And birds are one of those pollinators, but so are the insects and other critters. So that's exciting to think about and important. And thankfully, most like garden centers usually have a native plant section, so it's pretty easy to kind of find them now. It didn't used to be like that. Um, I know people that are listening in today, especially some of our students who might be living in a dorm or might be living in an apartment. Um, they might be living in a more of an urban or a suburban space. So how can a resident who's living in like an urban or suburban space who might have like limited space, how can they still make a meaningful difference in providing habitat for birds?
Yeah, I mean, this is the population I speak with most often, being in Baltimore City. We do have an awesome relationship with Baltimore City Rec and Parks and Forestry Division, so we are thinking about some of our larger green spaces and how they can be oases for birds, particularly as they're migrating. But the reality is that a bird, especially a migrating bird, can end up literally anywhere. And we might not think about cities as being a hot spot for birds, but the reality is that most birds are migrating at night. They're using the stars and the moon and the Earth's magnetism to be able to navigate and orient themselves. And so places like cities and towns that have light, a lot of outdoor lighting can actually kind of throw them off course. So a lot of birds do wind up in our cities, and they're going to be looking for any patch of green space that they can find. They're essentially going to fly until they're exhausted and then land wherever they are. So they might land in, a large park, or they might land on your back patio. That's really kind of up to chance. And so that's the, main reason that we try to talk to folks, because anybody's outdoor space, no matter how small or paved, can be a shelter or a rest stop, a migratory stopover spot for any of these individual birds. So they're going to need to be able to find shelter and food and avoid danger for long enough to be able to continue along their migratory journeys or find an appropriate nesting site. So that shelter could easily be your street tree. It could be the plants in your patio. These are all essentially like stepping stones connecting with your neighbors and connecting with parks that will serve as corridors for our migrating birds. So, any form of shelter is great, but our space can be doubly important if we are using it to generate as much bird food, aka insects, as possible, because every family of birds is then going to need thousands of caterpillars in order to survive and get their chicks to fledge their nests. So even folks who have raised beds or container gardens. I actually did a workshop last night where we were talking with some people about how we can basically cram as many native plants into those spaces as possible. And I encourage people to kind of think of their outdoor spaces like outdoor rooms. So instead of thinking about where do I want to put this plant, think about, where do I want to walk? Where do I want to do different activities? And kind of plan those spaces to be free of plants, but then build up the walls and the ceilings of those outdoor rooms with as many layers of plants as possible. And if you have a yard, then we're planting things in the ground, and we're planting ground covers and a perennial layer and a shrub layer and maybe trees if we have that kind of space. But if we have a small space, then we can still fit some, smaller woody plants and a perennial and an herbaceous layer into some of those potted plants. And I can give one specific example. I live in Baltimore City. I live in a row house, and early in COVID, a lot of us, I think, were spending a lot of time indoors, and noticing things that were going on outside our houses. And I actually saw a Swainson's thrush outside my house, which is a neotropical migratory bird species. Not a species I would think that I would see from my house. I've also seen a scarlet tanager outside my house. So these are birds that, are kind of on their way, and they are dropping down and trying to find anything that they can. And like I said, can literally land anywhere. And so trying to provide as many resources for them as possible for them to be able to stop and rest and refuel and continue along their journeys.
That's exciting. It's thinking of things that you can just see from your own space. And I had this analogy in my mind as you were describing. Essentially, these birds are on a massive journey and they need to stop. I imagine just the times when I've had to drive with my family up the coast, usually maybe like up the New Jersey Turnpike, and how there's a rest break with food and shelter and water and every few miles. And it's essentially the same version of that for bird species. They need to be able to stop and rest and refuel. So I kind of like thinking of it like that, because then you might get some really unique birds
Mhm.
appearing for a rest in your yard. Um, I know you've worked on several projects, so can you highlight some successful community-led bird-friendly gardening initiatives that you've worked on through Audubon Mid-Atlantic?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned this in as you were introducing me as well, which I appreciate. That our goal in Baltimore is to make our public green spaces as bird friendly, but also as people friendly as possible. So, we do a lot of work sharing how to create habitat for birds and pollinators, but at the same time, we're also trying really hard to listen to people's needs and trying to find the places where our goals can overlap. And this might be like a spoiler alert to everybody on the call today, because you've obviously self selected as somebody who wants to hear somebody talk about birds, but not everyone likes birds. And we're not really out there trying to convince people to like birds, but people generally like, flowers and trees that create shade and sort of these beautiful, safe, healthy outdoor spaces. So when we share how layers of native plants also support butterflies and soak up floodwater and cool off our streets, people are generally on board with that. But it's a process, and it takes some kind of relationship building. So I can give an example. Right now, we're working in a neighborhood called Lakeland, and Lakeland has this really special park, and within that park, there's actually a patch of forest. So we're, trying to meet as many different people in Lakeland as possible to hear how they interact with the park, how they interact with the forest. We actually just finished a series of community engagement sessions over this winter and spring to, share information, but also let people express their concerns about the realities of urban forests and urban parks, and also their preferences when it comes to the types of plants and how they want their park to look and feel. And so we're taking all of that feedback, as well as what we know about what birds need as they are migrating and nesting, and we will turn all of that into a forest edge restoration project, a planting that will happen along with the community next month. So we do this with lots of partners. It's not something that we, come in and we know everything and we're going to use all of our scientific know-how to make it happen. Because, we can't, as a single organization, be in one area forever. We know that if we want a habitat restoration project to succeed in the long term, that it takes some real buy-in from people who live there, and it needs to work for them. So I'm excited because we at Audubon haven't done a forest edge restoration before. We've done lots of kind of smaller gardens with maybe smaller woody plants and perennials. So this is really exciting, and getting to show people, like, look at the bloom times we'll have from these native trees, understory trees early in the spring, and how we select different kinds of plants and arrange them in a certain way that will make people feel invited into this forest, with which maybe they're familiar with, or maybe they've never thought it was for them. So that's our goal. And each project looks different, but they all have this kind of longer timeline than what people might think, in order to kind of build that trust and get the amount of community input and support that we need to make sure that the project is going to be a success. And at the same time, super excited to talk with people about how can you replicate what we're doing in the park at your own home. So we'll do workshops and native plant giveaways, so that people can kind of see what their individual impact can be on this park project that's happening in their neighborhood.
That's an exciting project to hear about. I'm just curious, like what kind of a timeline do you usually have for a project like that?
So if we think of a growing season as being a year, right? So from the time that we put plants in the ground and then see them through all 4 seasons, that's just the plant portion. The community engagement portion might be another year, and then
Mhm.
there's some follow-up. So ideally, we're talking about multiple years,
Mhm.
kind of on the ground with folks. A lot of that in the beginning is just listening, right? We're just trying to, show our faces and introduce ourselves, and hear from people what their concerns are before we start talking.
And I imagine in this process, you identify probably several community level champions, if you will, that essentially carry the baton after that period of time, where they are the ones that then maintain the space and continue the initiative. Is that my understanding correct?
Yeah, exactly. Those neighborhood champions are the people we're trying to form relationships with at the very beginning.
Okay.
And then, if we're lucky enough in this particular project, we have the support to actually pay community members a stipend to be really invested in the care of the planting in its establishment, and then into the future.
That's neat. It was a great model to hear about. Um, so what as a yard owner and then like being on a college campus in an urban space which has very much a lot of landscaping, what what common mistakes do people tend to make when they're trying to create a bird-friendly space? And then how can us novices how can we learn to avoid them?
Sure. Um, I have a feeling I'm gonna get some maybe a little pushback. It's okay. I can say things that
Okay.
are so I do get a lot of questions about bird feeders and birdhouses. Not to say
Hmm.
that bird feeders and birdhouses are a mistake. They're fine, and they allow us to engage with birds. They're almost, at least in an urban context, more for the people than they are for the birds in some ways. Like, we want to be able to see them, and that's great. Really, what we're trying to encourage people to do as much as possible is encourage people to think about layers of native plants as their bird feeders and as their nesting sites. Because bird feeders, a lot of times, they're providing seeds. They might be providing nectar if you have a hummingbird feeder. They might be providing some fat if you have some suet. But our landscape can provide nectar and seeds and berries, and really importantly, insects. I'm always going to bring it back to the insects. And then there's some upkeep. I mean, there's upkeep with landscape too, but there's some really important upkeep involved in bird feeders and nest boxes in order to keep them clean. Anytime we're inviting birds or anybody, we're all hygiene experts at this point, to congregate in one place, then there's the possibility of the spread of, pests and parasites and diseases among those individuals. So really important if you do have bird feeders and bird houses to make sure you're looking at the best ways to keep those clean. So I wanted to put that out there just as a little bit of food for thought. The other thing that I will mention, because I like to call this time of year stinky mulch season. Depending where you are in the city or elsewhere, you don't have to go far right now before you find a truck unloading gallons and gallons of black mulch onto somebody's landscape. And, mulch has its place ecologically. It's holding moisture in the soil and preventing weeds. I would offer that planting a ground cover layer, which is something that people often forget when they're planning their landscape, that ground cover layer can do those same functions as gallons of black mulch, which aren't really doing a whole lot for the environment. And in fact, a lot of times that really dark mulch can actually create a really harsh growing condition for the plants that are growing there because it's absorbing the sun, it's getting really hot, maybe moisture is evaporating from the soil, and it's not very resilient. So if a big rainstorm comes through, that mulch can wash away. So, alternatively, ground covers, these might be like grasses, sedges, ferns, depending on the conditions of the site. These are the little plants that can grow in between our blooming perennials, underneath our shrubs, and they're providing so many services to that landscape. So those ground covers are doing erosion control, weed control, they're holding moisture in the soil, which makes a better growing condition for the plants around them. So and then just habitat for all of our kind of ground cover foraging birds. So if we think about our sparrows, our thrushes, our towies, these are the types of birds that are all kind of scratching around and looking for food in that kind of like ground cover understory layer. That's providing them with that really important habitat. So I would say most common mistake that I'm seeing today, this week, is just gallons of mulch being poured everywhere when we could achieve that same. It's a different aesthetic. I get that kind of like that's sort of like a people thing is like that very neat and tidy and cared for. I would offer that ground cover plants can look just as beautiful if we invest in some cues to care. And again, like chatting with our neighbors and talking about why we're making this choice in our landscapes.
I'm glad you mentioned that because that is indeed the season of stinky mulch. Yes, and I also find too as a gardener, like you if you have an effective ground cover, like you don't have to weed as much. But if you have the black mulch, then the weeds are very obvious, and you have to weed them a lot more frequently too. So in terms of labor, it's nicer.
Right.
And since you mentioned bird feeders, actually we had a question in the chat asking if you can talk a little bit about the best policy on bird feeders in our yards, when to use them, is there a time we should not use them, how many feeders, what kinds of seed, that kind of thing. So I mean, for the most part, you answered most of that, but is there anything else you wanted to add with respect to like maybe amount or seed type?
Yeah. I mean, bird feeders have their place. Again, it's great for us to be able to engage with birds and see them. There are a few rules that I would suggest. So one of the biggest threats, and I think we're going to get to talking about this, but one of the biggest threats to birds in and around our homes and our buildings is collisions with windows. So if we
Mm.
have to place them either less than 3 feet or more than 30 feet from a window. So the idea is if those feeders are less than 3 feet, then if a bird takes off and flies into a window, it's not going to be going fast enough to be able to injure itself. And then more than 30 feet, then the window isn't maybe so much part of that situation. Another rule that I would suggest is to try to have plantings surrounding that bird feeder where birds can kind of take shelter if a predator comes, but not having any plants immediately underneath that bird feeder where a predator can hide. So I'm thinking about outdoor cats or something that might be able to sneak up on your birds at your bird feeder. Not giving those predators a place to hide, but giving those birds somewhere that they can kind of fly to and seek shelter. And then in terms of what you actually put in your bird feeders, I know this can be a challenge and not everybody has the same resources, but I would encourage people to try to invest in as high of quality of bird seed as possible. And the reason for that is that less expensive bird seeds are often filled with lots of fillers. So if you kind of look at the list of ingredients which the bird feed should have, it might list things like millet and sorghum. Those are kind of filler seeds that a lot of birds are just kind of scratch around until they find the good stuff. And then you are kind of left with a mess of all of this bird seed on the ground, which can attract pests and things that you don't want. So highest quality of bird seed are going to have things like hulled sunflower seeds, thistle or Niger seeds. If you have a situation where you can have suet and you can kind of get some fat in there, then that's great too. But mostly I want to encourage people to just keep their bird feeders as clean as possible. They do require some upkeep. Making sure that they can't collect water, they can't grow fungus, and they can't allow birds to spread diseases to each other.
Thank you. Those are really good tips. And now I'm gonna go back to my yard and double check that I've met those conditions. I probably have bird feeders too close to windows so that visually impaired me can see them. So beyond gardening, what are some broader landscaping strategies that homeowners and communities can use to create bird-friendly environments? So maybe zooming out a bit more.
Yeah. So I mentioned this earlier. One of the first things I talk about in our workshops is that idea of thinking about our outdoor spaces as outdoor rooms. So whether you have a patio or a yard, to be really identifying those smaller areas where we want to actually do activities, and then build in the landscape, working from the edges in, so that we can have, basically less turf grass or paved patio, whatever the case may be. So I talk a lot in my workshops about how to actually design the layers of plants that go into creating the walls of those outdoor rooms. But the main point is to use as many layers of plants as possible. I mentioned a few different types of birds that are going to almost exclusively use specific layers of vegetation. So we can really increase the amount of biodiversity we're supporting in our landscapes by planting as many layers as can fit. So everything from the ground covers all the way up to the canopy. Thinking about the activities that we want to do in our outdoor spaces, slowly filling in all of the other spaces with as many layers of plants as possible. And then the other kind of broader tip I would give, and this takes some time and some effort. It's maybe not something that everybody can do right away, but in thinking about kind of our goals and our plans as we're introducing more plants, is to try to mass plants together in clusters as much as possible, instead of planting individual specimens of each species. And I know this is tricky, and I can be a little bit autobiographical and tell you how when I had my first place and I had a patio and I wanted to do some container plantings, and I went plant shopping and everything looks so beautiful and it's so exciting, especially this time of year. And I'll just speak for myself and use I statements. I want one of everything, right? So like I want one of this and I want one of this and I want one of this. And what we kind of end up with is this plant zoo a little bit. And
That's a great
a couple,
term.
yeah, a couple of issues with that. First, our landscapes aesthetically can look a little bit like unhinged, and not so cohesive. And then, ecologically speaking, our pollinators and our seed eaters are actually going from one bloom to the next like this. And so, if we have individual specimens of plants or plants are spaced too far apart, then those insects or birds are wasting a lot of energy kind of traveling back and forth between plants. So ideally, I would have, a mass or like a cluster of all one species. Yes, I might have ground cover plants kind of growing up between them, but let's say I have, 5 milkweed plants instead of one milkweed plant. That's going to make that a lot more attractive to insects and birds that are either trying to find their host plant or trying to find a nectar source, whatever the case may be. So, clusters and avoid the plant zoo.
I've been guilty of the plant zoo too. I think that's normal for new gardeners. I want to remind our audience that you can ask questions in the chat or the Q&A button, either one. And I'm going to try and give voice to those. Actually, I can start doing that now because I have only really one big question left. So Christina asked, she said she lives in Baltimore City. She'd like to start a bird garden. What native plant would you suggest for beginners to purchase that's more reasonable with price? She sees blue jay birds and cardinals and golden finch frequently in her backyard.
Nice. Um, Honestly, any any native plant will be awesome. And if you have a lot of time and want to learn about, winter seed sowing, or want to join some gardening groups on, social media or in your neighborhood, you can be on the lookout for plant swaps or seed swaps. There really are kind of low investment, low financial investment ways of getting started. The first plants that I put in my Baltimore City backyard, well, I'll say like singular, the first plant I put in my backyard was a sweet bay magnolia tree that I got from a tree giveaway. And this is something that Blue Water Baltimore is an organization, but even, rec and parks, you can kind of look for these free tree giveaways. I planted one sweet bay magnolia, and then the next year I planted a second free sweet bay magnolia, and both of those trees are now as tall as my house, and that was not very many years ago. So in terms of financial investment, there are ways to kind of hack the system and get plants, for free or grow them from seed, by yourself, and just kind of do a little bit at a time. I've just kind of worked my way down in the layers in my yard and also like out, kind of like coming from the edges and working my way into the yard, leaving, a couple pathways and a little area where my dog can go. Um, but just a little bit at a time. I don't have room for canopy trees in my yard, so that those magnolia trees are kind of understory trees. I decided that was the tallest layer that I could start with, and then I've kind of worked my way down in the landscape over time.
Oh, that's nice. That's lovely to hear. I love magnolias. We've had two folks ask in the chat about like, do you have like a best ground cover or a native ground cover that you recommend? Or you probably have a list of top 5 or 10, but to kind of avoid the use of mulch.
Yeah. It really depends on the characteristics of each site. And we can also, um, I think it can be overwhelming for people when we're like, okay, well, what are the characteristics of my property and what type of plant community might thrive here? I think it is good to take a look at our landscape as a whole for some things, but when it comes time to choose specific plants, to remember that regardless of what size our property is, it's probably a collection of microhabitats, each with slightly different conditions. So the first task is kind of zooming in and getting really well acquainted with how many hours of sunlight does this spot get, how moist is the soil, what's the texture of the soil, and knowing those things to help us choose a community of native plants that can thrive there. If you're not really sure what kind of questions to ask, there is a handout on our website called Getting Started that can kind of like walk you through some of these questions to ask. So I can definitely share some of those things. My go-tos when it comes to ground covers for shade is probably going to be some type of fern. I love some of the evergreen ferns, especially because we get to look at them all year and provide some winter interest. In sunnier spots, I'm usually looking at sedges. There are shade-loving sedges as well, but I think sedges are kind of a undervalued plant in the landscape, and sedges are on my top 10 list of herbaceous plant groups to use. I'm going to point people to one amazing resource. If you are not familiar with or haven't visited Mount Cuba in Delaware, it's like an amazing botanical garden, but it's also home to some really awesome research. And they produced a report recently, which maybe everybody won't be as excited about this as I am, but it's a review of sedges for the mid-Atlantic. And it actually tested all of these different species of sedges for how sun tolerant, shade tolerant, and many other qualities. And also how each of the species responds to getting mowed. So they're trying to encourage people to use these native sedge species as lawn alternatives, and which of them can actually be mowed to a height of 3 or 4 inches and still survive. So I would encourage everybody for some really exciting reading to look up the Mount Cuba report on sedge species for the mid-Atlantic. And from there, you can almost definitely choose a ground cover species that's going to work in almost any conditions that you have.
Oh, good. That's exciting to hear because I have a lot of microclimates in my own yard, and some are like perpetually shady, and then others just bake in the sun. And finding ground cover has always been a bit of a challenge, especially a native ground cover. So
And I
yeah.
have spaces that are both of those things. So at certain times of day, they're
Mhm.
completely shaded, and then at other times of day, they're being completely baked for the sun by the sun. And that's sort of the reality of living in, the built environment
Mhm.
and having landscape qualities that are maybe not so common in nature because this spot in my yard is getting shaded by my house most of the day, and then it's getting like the direct late afternoon hottest sun of the day. And finding species that are adapted to that quality, which is not super common in nature, it's one of my biggest challenges.
I've got a lot of questions pouring in, so this is a good
Oh gosh.
conversation. While people are still kind of getting their thoughts together and writing questions, I was going to ask my last question for you, which was basically, what do you see are the biggest threats to birds in residential and urban areas? Because you'd mentioned lights earlier in terms of confusion.
Yeah.
And also with that in mind, with those threats, what steps can individuals take to minimize those dangers?
Yeah. So the sad reality, and I hope somebody asks a positive question after this, but
We'll get there.
the sad reality is that generally speaking, the birds are not all right. We have 3 billion fewer birds today than we did 70 years ago. So that's the span of one human lifetime. We have so many fewer birds, and that is a result of a lot of things. So I'll name a few and then I'll try to end on a positive note. Um, Fact number one, outdoor cats kill about 2.5 billion birds every year in the US alone. So we got to keep our kitties inside where they can safely murder the arms of our sofas. Um, Two, I mentioned earlier about window strikes. About 1 billion birds are killed by window strikes every year, and many more are injured. So we need to be thinking about how to um, um, basically disrupt the reflectivity of the exterior of our windows. But essentially, what's happening is birds see the landscape reflected in the window and they think they're flying into a tree. So anything we can
Mhm.
do to kind of break up that reflection. My favorite product that I put on my house is called Feather Friendly. Invasive plants, tricky because if they take over a native landscape, it can make it more difficult for insects to find their hosts, lots of other issues. So identifying and trying to remove and replace any invasive plants in our landscape, and preferably not planting the invasive plants. We have some great legislation now in the state of Maryland that's helping with that. Pesticides, mostly in the agriculture industry, reducing our insect population by about 9% every decade. So lots of issues. The number one issue, the number one threat to birds is actually climate change, which feels like this big thing that we can't individually tackle. But the best thing we can actually do to combat climate change and support birds is to plant more of their habitat
Mhm.
because those plants are carbon sinks, right? Those plants are absorbing carbon. That's what plants do. And then as birds' ranges are shifting or shrinking as a result of climate change, they need to be able to find the things that they need in their habitat. And so the more habitat that we plant, the more likely those birds whose ranges have been disrupted by climate change will be to actually find the things that they need. And then, like I said, convincing all of our neighbors to do the same thing, even if you are kind of moving slowly with your landscape, which is totally fine. That's the tact that I've taken as well. As many neighbors as we can convince to get on board with this is the solution. Try to keep it positive. Sometimes these conversations can get a little bit, hairy. Try to find common ground and solution based. But that's what I would say. Just kind of like talk people's ears off.
I'm glad you mentioned that, like those relationships with neighbors. And one of our, I forget who it was who posted this in the chat. I guess it was Jane. A lot of gardeners, especially native gardeners, will try to harvest seeds and share seeds. And I've even had just friends that were gardeners share cuttings of plants for propagation. And that's a nice way to just kind of find like a common ground with your neighbors, no matter like what they do. Or if you guys have a love of plants, and everyone loves flowers, right? Sharing cuttings, sharing seeds, especially if they're natives, that's better because then you're helping share the bounty of your own area, and you're kind of helping encourage their love for growing things too. So thank you for pointing that out, Jane. We had a few folks talk about invasives, and I know from my own circle of gardeners, invasives can be very daunting. I think someone mentioned they had no, wait, that's the wrong one. Someone mentioned that there was an olive shrub.
Olive, maybe.
Yeah, and I have a fellow student who's always lamenting the bamboo that she's dealing with in the yard that she inherited. Um, it's tricky. I want your thoughts on like when we're trying to tackle invasives and get them under control and eradicate them. Sometimes the cure seems sometimes worse than the actual invasive. Just my opinion. Like if we have to get out the big guns in terms of pesticides. Um, what are your thoughts on that in terms of like invasive eradication, and is sometimes the cure worse for the bird population or the insect population? Is there a way to maintain like a balance, or in some cases does it really just need to go?
Yeah. I would say in the long term, it's better for the bird population to remove that plant and replace it. So I can't make a lot of blanket statements about invasive species because
Mhm.
the management for each species is going to be different. But one blanket statement I can make about all invasive plants is that if that plant by whatever means planted itself in that spot, it's because the conditions there were perfect for that plant to grow. And so if we remove it and leave that space bare,
Mhm.
it will plant itself again or it will keep growing there. So really important as we're removing invasive plant species to immediately replace it with, in some cases, a native plant that's just as aggressive. I can give the example in my front yard. I inherited some English ivy, and I actually I waited to remove it because I wasn't prepared yet to immediately replace it. And why put myself through all of that work of, taking it out to have it come right back. So eventually I was able to remove it and I replaced it with Virginia creeper, which, if anybody knows anything about Virginia creeper, can be its own kind of headache. But in my mind, that was the proper kind of sacrifice, is planting this aggressive native plant that I know supports, moth species. And, I live with it. I like prune it every year and it's occupying that space. The English ivy has not come back. So remove and replace is the kind of blanket piece of advice that I would give. There really are only a few methods to remove invasive species, and the management and the timing is going to differ depending on that species. But we are either manually, digging it up or removing it, um, killing it with some kind of chemical, which hopefully can be as localized as possible, like painting it onto a stump, this really kind of focused spot treatment, or covering and smothering an area, which takes a lot more time, but is, maybe healthier for the environment. But those are really kind of the only three methods. So the practice or whatever is going to be the most practical for the situation, it's going to depend on the scale and the species. But immediately replacing that plant with something that can kind of hold its ground is the only way to try to fight it from coming back. And maybe it'll still come back, and we just have to kind of try to fill that niche with native plants as much as possible, in an effort to keep the invasives from coming back.
Thank you for that suggestion. And it's almost like fighting a battle, if you will, with the invasive. But I like your recommendation of like you've got to replace, or else it's just going to keep coming back. It's just going to take over. One of our listeners mentioned that they're in Florida, and the University of Florida has an extension service which has a lot of Florida-friendly landscaping help. I wanted to point out too that a lot of states, I know like Maryland, I believe Delaware does, they have like in Maryland, University of Maryland has an extension campus. I believe University of Virginia, a lot of those land grant universities have an extension where they have some great information on like how to get rid of an invasive, what's the proper way, and what are some good native alternatives. So in addition to the Audubon Society, you probably have a state level extension service that I encourage you guys to explore if you're joining from a different state. Indeed. We had one question that was, is there any particular plants to like avoid at all costs in Maryland?
I would say any of those plants that have been labeled as invasive, which depending on the kind of ranking of severity, they are legally required to be labeled at nurseries, but we don't always get our plants from nurseries. So, a really common one is English ivy. It's a great shade tolerant ground cover vine. It's evergreen. I can see like aesthetically why people would plant it, but that one is a no-no. It will literally climb up and kill our trees. We're dealing with it in almost every forest in Baltimore that I can think of. Another really common one, because it has such a confusing name, is butterfly bush. And this one
Mm.
we've known that it is invasive for a while, but there was a long period of time, and this is the case for a lot of species, where, okay, this is a non-native plant, but its flowers produce tons of nectar and it's attracting lots and lots of adult butterflies and pollinators. So, isn't it great? And that's where I would kind of caution people and really emphasize sticking to native plants, because plants don't necessarily become invasive overnight. The butterfly bush, the Buddleia davidii, is a great example of this. It can take decades or centuries even for a plant to develop the ability to escape cultivation. And but that's a really common one that I hear, because it does attract lots of butterflies and they love it and it's very beautiful. But it does not support the full life cycle of those butterflies because their caterpillars aren't eating it. And now it's spreading and planting itself elsewhere. So if we do have these plants in our landscape, now we have to cut off the flowers before they go to seed and do all these other things. But I would say a great alternative is to plant something like Joe Pye weed, which also has tons of nectar and attracts lots of adult butterflies and feeds lots of butterfly babies too.
That's a good suggestion and good recommendations. I know we're getting close to the end of our talk, so I'm definitely going to reach out to you afterward and see if there's any resources you want me to share in the when I send out the recording, because I know we've had a lot of good questions, and I'm hoping that maybe in the long term, as people continue to work on their spaces and make them more bird friendly, we'll hear feedback from our listeners today, maybe circling back in a few months or even a year if it takes a while to get your projects underway. But thank you very, very much, Erin, for all of your insight, especially very timely talk in the spring about now that we're all thinking about gardening and the birds. And if the audience would join me, I know you're in the chat, so there's not much you can do, but join me giving virtual applause from the chat and a
Oh,
virtual thank you to Erin. We really appreciate our talk today. And yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to Goucher College for always hosting our webinar. And happy gardening, you guys, as you continue to work on improving your spaces. Thank you.
thank you so much.